Think of chivalry, and you might imagine knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. Chivalry originated in ideals associated with a knight's code of conduct. Over time, it came to more broadly represent a model for the behavior and moral principles of the upper classes.
We can think of chivalry as a code of honor that really came to fruition in the 11th and 12th centuries. And many of the values that chivalry championed are things that we still value today. Loyalty, bravery, protection of the weak.
Chivalry wasn't just about gallant acts meant to impress a princess. It widely affected culture, from love relationships to hunting, fashion to law. This illustrated E is contained within a medieval law book. You see two knights on horses facing one another. They are about to settle a disagreement over a debt. Hunting was a chance to improve oneself physically and mentally, not unlike the goals of chivalry.
It's typical in these stories that there is an aristocrat or a knight who is in love with a woman of a higher social standing that's already married. It was thought that the man's love for this higher standing woman would have had a civilizing effect on him.
During the Middle Ages, life was very hard. What counted was survival, not chattering about emotions. But in the 12th century, despite her wars, Europe regained a certain financial ease. The nobility began to have some time to amuse itself. People rediscovered the refinement, the intoxication, the elegance of expressing one's love. That was the birth of courtly love.
Courtly love really was endless discussions of what a man and woman could feel about each other and how they were to behave with each other. This all, by the way, is outside of marriage, has nothing to do with marriage. The fundamental idea of it was that a man was inspired by a woman he saw who to him was the representation of beauty, goodness, everything fine and wide. In fact, a sort of an idea borrowed from Plato, the idea of the good, but in the person of a female. So he wanted her, but if he were to possess her physically, somehow she'd be just a real person. She would no longer be an ideal.
One displayed one's love by delicate remarks intended to attract the beloved's attention. The more obstacles there were to conquer, the more precious the beloved became.
Chivalry started in France in the 12th century. Originally, the word referred to being like a knight. In the mid-12th century, the word started to mean the ideal characteristics of a knight. A knight was no longer chivalrous because of his horse and his lance. Instead, he was expected to present a certain set of virtues, like honor, honesty, and generosity. You see, knights really didn't have a good reputation before the introduction of the chivalric code. They were basically hired thugs who, while highly trained and heavily armed, had a penchant for violence and destruction. We don't know exactly why the conception of chivalry changed to include an ethical code, but it was probably, at least in part, due to the influence of the church. In the 14th century, a new literary genre was established, the Romance. Medieval romances were poems and songs that took inspiration from folklore and history to tell stories of adventure, forbidden romance, and knights in shining armor. Think, for example, of the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. These stories were extremely influential on knights of the time, who began to want to emulate the characters from the stories. Common qualities seen as chivalrous that appeared more often than not were courage, military prowess, honesty, honor, loyalty, justice, good manners, and generosity. In the modern day, the term chivalry usually refers to a respectful and gentlemanly treatment of women. This was indeed a part of chivalry in the Middle Ages too, though perhaps not quite in the way we might think. Courtly love described a specific type of platonic, or at the very least non-sexual, love between a knight and a lady, who was usually unavailable, either by being already married or being of a higher social class. Think Lancelot and Guinevere from the Arthurian legends. Guinevere was already married to King Arthur, but Lancelot fell deeply in love with her. At first it was just pining, and Lancelot had no plans to act on his feelings. But once Guinevere returned his affections, they started a sordid love affair. Of course, in the ideal courtly love relationship, no affair would take place. It was seen to be beneficial for a young knight to have a lady to have his eye on. It would civilize him and make him an even more effective knight, as he would try to impress her. Ladies would sometimes give knights objects, like a handkerchief, as a show of favor before the knight went off to battle. This was meant to encourage the knight to fight his best. As you can see, this sort of culture really only applied to high-class women. Also, there's less respect and more admiration. The knights put these women on a pedestal. Historians have a difficult time separating which parts of chivalry were really followed and which were just fiction. You see, much of what we know of chivalry comes from those romances from the 14th century. How much of this was descriptive of the real chivalric code isn't easy to know. Chivalry had more than one function in society. While it was a way of keeping brutish knights in line, it also had the secondary function of solidifying the separation between the upper classes and the lower classes. Only well-born men were able to become knights, and therefore only upper-classmen were taught chivalric ideals. Contemporary historians have a habit of seeing chivalry as either a poetic and literary invention that was never really followed by medieval knights, or as a chauvinistic elitist system that's only purpose was to solidify the power of the nobility. Both of these charges have some merit, of course, but I think they go too far. Many knights in the Middle Ages took the chivalric code very seriously, and while they might not always have lived up to it, it doesn't mean it wasn't real to them. Also, while chivalry was not perfect, it did have some positives. For one, chivalry really did bring knights in line. Before the 12th century, knights were feared by basically everybody. Monks in their monasteries and churches would often pray that the knights wouldn't raid their homes. So, while knights after the introduction of chivalry weren't perfect, they were certainly worse before.